listener production.
Hey, Tara Cassidy with you and welcome to The Briefing. Whether you've been reading the news or just scrolling your socials, you would have heard something about this ongoing debate around ADHD, specifically whether it's overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed in Australia.
Overdiagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, a label that can do more harm than good.
More people are being diagnosed, especially adult women, narrowing the gap with men.
Overdiagnosing children with autism and ADHD.
One of the most common mental disorders is becoming a fashion statement.
Just last week, Professor Patrick McGorry wrote an op-ed before going on primetime telly to spark the debate once more, where he claimed part of the uptick in cases we're seeing is because it's trendy, outraging advocates and people with ADHD like me. In the second half of this episode, I'll explain why, and you'll hear from one of the leaders in Australia's ADHD space on why you shouldn't listen to anyone or any headlines that's arguing one side, black and blue. First though, let's get into the headlines with Helen Smith. It's Monday, the 14th of April.
Good morning, Tara, and good morning to you listening at home. Happy Monday. What a weekend it's been for politics, both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton officially launching their election campaigns. Dutton from a conference in Western Sydney and Albo from Perth, with each leader announcing some fresh and pretty major policies, the biggest relating to housing and appealing to first home buyers. So, Dutton's proposal will make interest paid on mortgages tax deductible for first home buyers of new builds, which will see an average earner family get about 11 grand a year back, or 55 over 5 years, which it's capped at, or the first 650k of a mortgage, whichever comes first. Meantime, our PM announced that he was going to unlock 100,000 new homes if re-elected, and will also allow first home buyers to purchase with a 5% deposit.
Yeah, wow, and that's another pretty big move. The difference between a 5% and 10% deposit is massive. If we look at, say, a $700,000 home, that would be bringing the deposit down from needing $70,000 at 10% to just $35,000 at 5%. Now, both leaders announced the policies to a packed room of supporters. For Anthony Albanese, that included the likes of former PM Julia Gillard and former Deputy PM Kim Beazley, while for Dutton, we saw ScoMo, Tony Abbott and John Howard in the crowd. Now, with just 1 week until pre-polling opens up to voters, it looks like both sides are really gearing up to make sure they make a lasting impression before people hit the polls, with the next week really critical, Helen.
Yeah, the election is coming up quicker than we imagine. And interestingly, we also saw some US-style politics rearing its head over the weekend at a Liberal National Party press conference, with coalition frontbencher Jacinta Price channeling a bit of Donald Trump.
And we have incredible candidates right around the country that I'm so proud to be able to stand beside and to ensure that we can make Australia great again, that we can bring Australia back to its former glory, that we can get Australia back on track.
Do you want to make Australia great again? I want to get rid of a bad government. That's what I want to do.
Very interesting. And what was bizarre is that when questioned on this later, that statement about make Australia great again, Jacinta Price actually walked back that comment about the reference to the US and Trump. She said she didn't realise she'd even said those words. So I don't know, you can make up your mind on that one, but definitely both sides bringing out the big guns a week out of pre-polling.
The family and friends of 6 innocent people who were murdered in the Bondi Junction stabbing attack have paid tribute to their loved ones 1 year on, while the parents of the attacker have highlighted the need for a focus on the country's mental health system. Yesterday marked 12 months since the 40-year-old Joel Couchy killed 6 people and injured several others at the Westfield shopping centre before being shot dead by police.
Yeah, and he'd reportedly stopped taking his schizophrenia medication and had been flagged multiple times to police due to his deteriorating mental health, including claims from his father that he'd stolen knives from their property. Now, yesterday, crowds gathered in Sydney to pay tribute to the victims and lay flowers at the site, with the New South Wales Premier coming out and saying that the government will work with the victims' families on trying to get a permanent memorial.
And an inquest into the fatal attack will begin in 2 weeks' time and look into the circumstances surrounding the attack, including emergency and security response, mental health care, and media coverage since.
To the US now, where one of the biggest Me Too cases involving Harvey Weinstein is going back on trial in New York this week as backlash against women's rights in the US unfolds across the country. Harvey Weinstein was convicted of sexual criminal assault in the first degree and rape in the third degree back in 2020, but was acquitted on 3 other counts, including predatory sexual assault.
And in April last year, an appeals court ruled that the judge had unfairly allowed testimony against him from other women whose allegations were not part of the charges against him. So the new case will essentially be a redo of the first one, but will have one new crucial change, a new charge based on an allegation from a woman who was not part of the first prosecution. Now, Weinstein is currently serving a 16-year sentence, and Weinstein's publisher told The Guardian last week that it's a social justice witch hunt. So if he does win this redo, it will be a big loss for #MeToo, as his case was one of the biggest victories for the movement.
A number of Australian academics are refusing to attend conferences in the US out of fear of being detained because of the Trump administration. Academics are being told not to attend some conferences by the actual event organisers, particularly if they are trans or diverse, because of safety concerns, with many conferences switching attendance to hybrid so that they can join virtually.
Yeah, and US visa applicants were required to declare if they had a disability prior to the Trump administration. But according to Australian academics, there's been multiple accounts of people being stopped and detained or denied on the basis of their condition. So the concerns follow a report of a French scientist who was stopped and had his phone searched at the US border and denied entry after messages were found of him being critical of Trump on his phone.
And academics aren't the only ones actually cancelling their trips to the US. Australian award-winning comedian Alice Fraser also canned her upcoming visit after receiving legal advice that she could be stopped at the border because of previous jokes she made about the Trump administration. So really interesting that it's kind of impacting all sectors and people rethinking their plans based on Trump 2.0.
And Australia's answer to Usain Bolt. Gout Gout has broken another record over the weekend at the Australian Athletics Championships in Perth, making him officially faster than Bolt at the same age.
Here comes Gout Gout. We knew we'd see this in the final 50, so let's watch the young superstar rise. He's flying. He will be Gout of this universe.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Gout of this universe.
Yeah, so the 17-year-old ran the men's 200 metre in 19.84 seconds.
Wow.
But sadly, the record won't be listed as an official PB because of illegal wind reading. So I keep seeing this illegal wind reading or wind assisted everywhere. And what it means, so wind readings can be at 2.0 metres per second or under for a time to be declared legal. But sadly, for Gout Gout, this race was 2.2 metres per second. He's ran into this same wind assist issue a few times now when running. So he's been breaking all these records, but they've all been declared illegal. But luckily for Gout Gout, though, his biggest competition over the weekend, Lachlan Kennedy, was disqualified from the final race after a false start.
And look, earlier in the week, Gout Gout, like you mentioned, he also broke another record running the under-20 men's 100 metres, again in under 10 seconds, but 2 times. But again, those performances also had the aid of those illegal wins, so they won't be counted in the official record books, but he's not letting it get him down. He's come out saying he'll keep running until the win's on his side one day and he can list that record pen to paper. Now, this latest sprint, though, was Gout's fastest run in his career to date, and as well as him taking out the Open Australian title, it also secures him a spot among the world's best at the World Athletics Championships in Tokyo this September, which is just incredible. And isn't it awesome to have an Aussie representing us on the world stage? And I wonder if he's going to give Usain Bolt a run for his money. Helen, what do you reckon?
Yeah, look, it's looking good. So fingers crossed. I'm touching my head. I'm keeping my toes crossed. I think he's got an amazing future at just 17 years old. We're going to, one to watch, keep going, and hopefully he can win us some gold one day.
Fingers crossed, absolutely. Well, that brings our headlines to a close for today. Thank you, Helen, and thanks to you listening at home. Next, we get into my deep dive into the controversy around ADHD in Australia and something that really got me peeved off last week, but you can hear more on that next up. Hey, Tara here, and I'm taking off my journo hat just for a minute to try and explain why something I saw in the news last week really pissed me off. It's about ADHD.
ADHD diagnoses. In an op-ed, McGorry says, quote, far too many people are seeking to have this label applied and that the consumer-driven phenomenon is fuelled at least in part by social contagion or fashion. His comments sparking outrage among some living with the condition.
ADHD is absolutely not a trend. Comments like that are really harmful because what it does is further perpetuate stereotypes. No one does this just for an accessory.
I have ADHD, and it is not fashionable. We're not seeing surging rates in diagnosis because it's the latest trend. It can be awful and debilitating, and it's been the reason for some of the worst days of my life to date. But you wouldn't know that by chatting to me day to day or from my social media feed. When I was first diagnosed over 10 years ago, nearly every conversation I was in where ADHD came up, and in articles and social media posts I'd see, it was comments like, oh, ADHD is so overdiagnosed. There's nothing wrong with you. Isn't everyone a bit ADHD these days? Or, oh, don't be lazy. You don't need medication. You just don't want to study. And, oh, people just want to put a label on everything these days. Let kids be kids. Let quirks be quirks. And unfortunately, back then, me being young and naive, it didn't take long before I was listening to the self-diagnosed mental health experts and internet trolls over a psychiatrist who'd been diagnosing ADHD for over 20 years. I stopped taking my medication and I pretended I had never been to his office at all. I continued to struggle for another 6 years. Until a few years ago, with a bit more maturity and a very supportive partner, I jumped back on the waiting lists again. I was re-diagnosed by a psychologist and a separate psychiatrist who put my self-denial at ease. Getting diagnosed, having a name for the things that I struggled with, getting therapy and learning strategies is one of the best things I have done in my life. It's improved it, my relationships, and me. But the sad part is, it could have happened a hell of a lot earlier if it weren't for the shame, the stigma, and the way we still talk it down in society. Okay, journo hat back on. So, as you're about to hear from a leader in Australia's ADHD space, there is a lot of misinformation out there and a lot more nuance to what's going on with ADHD diagnoses in Australia. Professor Dave Coghill is Chair of Developmental Mental Health at the Uni of Melbourne and President of the Australasian ADHD Professionals Association. Dr. Coghill, thank you so much for joining me on the briefing. We often see this debate about the prevalence of ADHD in Australia. There's some experts saying it's overdiagnosed, then others saying it's underdiagnosed. Which is it, and why can't we agree?
Because it's both. I think in general, ADHD for many, many years and currently still an issue goes unrecognized in a lot of people. So we know that around 5% of children and young people in Australia have ADHD, and around 2.5 to 3% of adults have ADHD. Up until recently, the numbers of children and young people getting diagnosed were quite a lot less than that. Now, actually, we're seeing the numbers coming towards equal in those groups. But we also know that there are a lot of children and young people who can't access care, can't access assessments. And so at the moment, I think we have to think that there may be some people who have been given a diagnosis of ADHD who may not meet all of the full criteria, but there are still many young people out there with ADHD who haven't got a diagnosis. For adults, it's probably similar, that there probably is a bit of a mix, but in adults in general, we're still not diagnosing the right numbers of people. So there are still many adults in Australia without a diagnosis. But I do worry that in recent years, some people may have had an assessment that falls short of good enough. And if you don't do a good enough assessment, you can't be sure about the quality of your assessment and the accuracy of your diagnosis.
Do you think the problem then is when there's experts or articles that don't portray that nuance? Are there any harms to, I guess, people being so one-sided on the debate?
No, I think it's hugely worrying. I see that there was an article by Professor McGorry suggesting that ADHD is a fashion diagnosis. ADHD is a real problem for people with ADHD, but on the other hand, there is an issue that ADHD has been portrayed quite differently recently on social media. I still wouldn't say it's a fashion and that nobody wants to have a diagnosis. But I think young people in particular may be misunderstanding what ADHD is from some of the communications that they've got. But I think, Tara, you're 100% right that anyone who sits at one side of the argument or the other is going to make mistakes and is going to be misleading. At ADPA, what we've really been pushing recently is for accurate assessments and accurate diagnoses. And, I think that's a message we really need to take that has a message for people at both ends of those other arguments that you're talking about.
Like you mentioned, we do often see people talking about ADHD on social media, or at least what they think it is, often talking about symptoms like forgetfulness or a struggle to focus. But we don't often see people talking about a lot of the other symptoms, which in my opinion, sometimes can be some of the most debilitating. I've got ADHD, and I know that it's very rare for people to talk about things like the emotional dysregulation side, or even things like rejection sensitivity dysphoria. Would you be able to explain to me a bit about each of those things?
Yeah, I think differently about both of those, Tara. I think that the emotional regulation problems that people have with ADHD should be recognized, and I think many experts would recognize as a core part of ADHD. There is a reason why they're not in the lists of core symptoms, and that's because not that they're not important, but because they don't tell ADHD apart from other conditions. So it's not helpful to just see the emotional regulation difficulties and say, that's ADHD, because there might be lots of other reasons why someone has those problems. But that's different from saying it's not a core part of ADHD. So it very much is. The rejection sensitivity, or I actually say the sensitivity to rejection, I genuinely don't think is a part of ADHD, but it's something that's very commonly experienced by people with ADHD. It's actually experienced by a lot of people who have spent their lives being told, no, you're wrong, who have felt like they're stupid because they're not performing as well as they know they should. And so I think the sensitivity to rejection is very much a consequence of ADHD, but also a consequence of the way people with ADHD have been supported or not supported, maybe is a better way of saying it, and the kind of reactions that they've got. And so I see it as something that's very understandable, and I'm not trying to play it down as an important part of people's lives, but I think it's more a consequence of the ADHD than actually an inevitable part. And the good thing about that is that if we start responding to people with ADHD differently, more positively, then they're not going to have that experience of constant rejection and feeling that they're not good enough. And so it's something we can really do something about.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, there's studies to show that people with ADHD often encounter more negative comments and criticism over their life, and perceived criticisms as well, which could fuel into what you were just saying.
It's actually even bigger than that, Tara. People with ADHD are victims of abuse more than people without ADHD, all different kinds of abuse and neglect. And so, yes, they get a lot of, not little, but a lot of constant negatives, but also they suffer some real big trauma.
There's also been calls for GPs to be able to prescribe ADHD medication and diagnose ADHD. Others saying that it's not the way, because if we're already seeing incorrect diagnosis from psychiatrists and psychologists, that we shouldn't open it up to GPs. What do you think?
Yeah, again, there's a nuanced answer to that, and the nuance is really important. Currently, very few healthcare professionals, very few specialists have actually received good quality training in how to assess, diagnose, and manage ADHD. And that includes psychiatrists. It also includes pediatricians. GPs are also part of a group that have not traditionally been trained, but GPs are experts in managing chronic health problems, and ADHD is a chronic health problem. So I believe, and our ADFA guidelines, our national guidelines on ADHD believe that there are many healthcare professionals who can contribute both to the assessment, the diagnosis, and the management of ADHD, but only if they receive adequate training and support. And so I think GPs are part of that group that could contribute hugely. So are nurses and nurse practitioners. I strongly believe that if we could provide, and if we were allowed and supported and funded to provide good enough training, then there are a whole wide range of healthcare professionals that could make a real valuable contribution to managing ADHD.
There was an inquiry not that long ago into ADHD in Australia. What did we learn from that, and what are we doing?
We learned that we don't do enough education. We learned that the access to services is poor, particularly access to services within the public health settings, particularly for people from more disadvantaged communities, be that remote, be that culturally and linguistically diverse, be that First Nations Aboriginal people. But even in the big cities, there's a real difficulty accessing care. There's a problem, as I said, with educating and supporting enough health professionals. But I have to say, although the recommendations of that Senate inquiry were really strong, the government's response has been really weak. They only actually supported one of the 15 recommendations. All of the other ones were supported in theory. But nobody's come back with any money, any plans, any way forward. And so I think we all, not just the professional community, but the ADHD community, need to be really disappointed in that. And going forward, whatever government we have after our election, we need to be talking to them and saying ADHD is important. Of course, people like you, Tara, people with ADHD actually have a stronger voice than professionals like me, because there are, as we said at the beginning, a lot of people with ADHD out there, and we need to try and help them bring that voice together and take that voice to the government.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Coghill, for joining me on the briefing.
Thank you, Tara.
That was Professor Dave Coghill from AADPA speaking with me there about the controversy surrounding ADHD diagnoses in Australia. And look, you know what I think, but I want to hear from you. Do you have ADHD or know someone with it? Maybe you've got your own story. Reach out and let us know. You can leave us a comment if you're listening on Spotify, a review on Apple, or you can get in touch via our Instagram page at The Briefing Podcast. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. But don't forget, we've got our afternoon ep coming up later today with Tash Belling. And as always, Chris Spiro and I will be back tomorrow morning for more headlines and another deep dive. Until then, I'm Tara Cassidy. See you next time.